I'm here this morning to celebrate Martin Luther King Day because a people who forget their past are destined to repeat it. We're here to remember the dream. We're here to remember what Dr. King and others alongside of him and others today still do.
Dr. Martin Luther King Day celebration is important to Lewisburg because we're in trying times, and it allows an opportunity for people to get together and to break bread and to share sentiments and compare notes on what actions we can take despite national politics and national craziness in our community to make this a better place where we all can get along.
Since 1983, Lewisburg has been celebrating Martin Luther King Day, and I think that's really, really important. It's a small community, and although West Virginia has a reputation of not being tolerant or understanding, I truly believe that the Lewisburg community and the Greenbrier Valley have a lot more to offer, and that it's very important for us to support something that is positive as opposed to always focusing on the negative.
I joined the march today because I grew up in a small town in Africa where people used to live very close to each other. So today is an opportunity for all of us, including the community, to have this interaction, to overcome similar obstacles in one unity.
Martin Luther King Jr. Proclamation 2021. Whereas in 1853, as the United States lurched toward civil war, Theodore Parker, a Unitarian clergyman, challenged his country to abolish slavery. Writing these words, "I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one, and I am sure it bends toward justice." And whereas on January the 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln fixed the seal of the United States upon the Emancipation Proclamation, which concluded with these words, "And upon this act, sincerely believed to be an act of justice, I invoke the consideration judgment of mankind and the gracious favor of Almighty God." And whereas in spite of victory in the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, in spite of the passage of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution in 1868, mandating equal justice, and the 15th Amendment in 1869 ensuring voting rights for all Americans, nevertheless, injustice in the form of segregation and systemic racism continued to plague our country for the next 100 years. And whereas March 31st, 1968, when the prophetic voice of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. echoed through the towering arches of the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., to a nation clamoring for the realization of fundamental civil rights, Dr. King declared, "We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." And whereas despite the assassination of Dr. King and the tragic impacts of an additional 52 years beneath systemic racism, faithfully we have pledged allegiance to one nation under God with liberty and justice for all. Thereby we have reaffirmed our belief that the vision of freedom and equality in America is not an unattainable idea, but rather it can be our tangible reality when we act together to claim liberty as our birthright and justice as our national destiny. And therefore I, Beverly White, Mayor of Lewisburg, West Virginia, proclaim the week of January the 18th to the 25th, 2021 to be Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Week. And in celebration of liberty and justice for all, I urge all of us collectively, no matter our politics or race or religion, to bend the arc of the moral universe toward justice. We experience a moral universe if we dedicate ourselves to make it so. We liberate ourselves and one another by exercising our hard-won civil and voting rights. By acts of decency, kindness, and mutual respect, we renew our nation's promise and honor a great leader who, by his example, illuminated the nonviolent, righteous pathway forwards towards our promised land of freedom and equality, a nation with liberty and justice for all.
Though the storms keep on raging in my life, and sometimes it's hard to tell the night from day. that hope that lies within is reassured as I keep my eyes upon the distant shore. I know he'll lead me safely to that blessed place he has prepared. But if the storm don't cease, and if the winds keep on blowing in my life, my soul has been anchored in the Lord. Though the storms keep on raging in my life, and sometimes it's hard to tell the night from day, still that hope that lies within is reassured as I keep my eyes upon the distant shore. I know he'll lead me safely to that blessed place he has prepared. And if the storms don't cease, and if the winds keep on blowing in my life, my soul has been anchored in the Lord. Oh, I realize that sometimes in this life we're gonna be tossed by the waves and the currents that seem so fierce. But in the Word of God, I've got an anchor, and it keeps me steadfast and unmovable despite the tides. And if the storm don't cease, and just in case the winds keep on blowing in my life, my soul has been anchored in the Lord, the Lord, the Lord. My soul has been anchored in the Lord, the Lord, the Lord. My soul has been anchored, my soul has been anchored, my soul has been anchored. My soul has been anchored, my soul has been anchored. My soul, my soul, my soul, my soul. The billows may flash, the billows may roll, I shall not sway because it holds me fast. So dark is the day, clouds in the sky, I know it's alright, 'cause Jesus is nigh. My soul, my soul, my soul, my soul, my soul has been anchored, My soul has been anchored. 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 My soul, my soul, my soul. My soul has been anchored. My soul has been anchored. My soul, my soul, my soul. My soul has been anchored in the Lord.
I'm glad to be here to march in the Martin Luther King celebration in Lewisburg. On the one hand, I'm sorry that we're still doing this, that we're still pursuing the justice and freedom that Martin Luther King stood for. But on the other hand, I'm encouraged because so many people saw fit to come, old, young, and in between.
I just think today is important to carry on the dream of Dr. King, who obviously was a great civil rights leader, who brought people together, and that's what we need right now in our country, is for folks to come together as a whole and make everything good.
Hello. Today, Martin Luther King Jr.'s celebration is very important to me because at a time when our President of the United States is demonizing any race other than his race, we have to take a stance and let him know that all people count. I'm a pastor, and so Revelation speaks to the fact that God came for all tongues, nations, and people, and that would include me. I am blessed to be here in West Virginia. I'm from Clifton Forge, Virginia, to celebrate with some other people. And I've already noted from being inside that there's a mix of races, which is what this nation has always been about. And so I'm here to celebrate that with all different kinds of people, nations, and tongues, and I'm excited about today.
Martin Luther King is an important day to me because of the African American family back then used to not have privileges as white people, but now Martin Luther King, we have those privileges, and I would like to say thank you to him. And we still have ways to go, but we'll make it.
Why today is important is because Martin Luther King gave a speech that changed the world.
This Martin Luther King celebration here in Lewisburg on Martin Luther King Day is especially important for every year that goes by, every month that goes by. It gets more and more important, and I think we're going to have a tremendous turnout today.
Martin Luther King's Day is important to me because it keeps people together, it brings people together, and helps people to dream.
Last week, we watched with horror as an angry mob walked down the streets of the nation's capital toward the Capitol with the intent of trying to disrupt the certification of the legitimate 2020 presidential election. This insurrectionist, seditious group is quite troubling to us here in America today. And the fact that they were inspired and coached on by the nation's president is even more quite troubling. As I watched them break into the nation's capital, as they overthrew the Capitol Police, and as I watched them walk through so arrogantly and stridently in defiance of law enforcement, what came to my mind was the words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King 50 plus years ago. And as the streets of Los Angeles, California was up in flames, as rioters and looters had threw Molotov cocktails into buildings and set them on fire, and as they were breaking the stores and looting and taking the merchandise that was there, King asked a very poignant question. Where do we go from here? From community to chaos? And I think that is a question that begs for a response today. Where do we go from here as a nation? But more importantly, where do we go from here as a state? As we observe the holiday celebration of the birthday of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, it is fitting that we would look to his legacy of nonviolence, peaceful protest and demonstration, and to look to him as a strident seal of how we can be disagreeing with our government, but we do it in a respectful way. But even more importantly, as we can look to Dr. Martin Luther King for guidance as to where we, as West Virginians, can go from here. The reason I pose that as a question is because there was at least one West Virginia legislator which has since shown the good wisdom and the dignity to resign before taking office. And there's been at least one legislator that has been on the radio very strident and saying there needs to be more protests and more demonstration. So it suggests that we need to examine ourselves here in the state of West Virginia in light of what's happening on the national scale and on the national scene. I was asked to share some thoughts around this idea. What do the words with liberty and justice for all, what do they really mean? And we say those words and immediately our mind goes to the Pledge of Allegiance. And for me, I have to back up another phrase where it says, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So when I read those words in that context, it takes on much more meaning to me as a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ. What can I do to promote us being one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all? And are we really committed in our great state to liberty and justice for all? I would like to submit some thoughts for your consideration, and then you conclude, are we committed in the state of West Virginia with liberty and justice for all? In 2003, during the general legislative session, the West Virginia legislature passed the Select Committee on Minority Affairs, and it led to the establishment of a committee on the Select Committee. This committee met over a year and a half, and they compiled a report, the Select Committee on Minority Affairs report. It outlined in detail the challenges facing African Americans in West Virginia. The report was summarized in 23 findings of facts, 36 specific recommendations of what could be done to address some of those findings of facts that were categorized into the general categories of issues of racial profiling, education, juvenile and adult criminal justice, employment, and economic development. But unfortunately, I'm here to say that after some 18 years after this report was compiled, very little has been done to implement any of the 36 recommendations to address those challenges. So I asked the question, are we committed in this state to liberty and justice for all? In 2005, at the request of the West Virginia State Supreme Court of Appeals, Dr. Stephen Haas did an analysis of juvenile justice data. There was concern among African Americans that maybe African Americans were being treated unfairly in the juvenile justice system. After his analysis, Haas compiled his report and he showed that black youth were arrested, detained, adjudicated delinquent, incarcerated, and transferred at a much higher rate than Caucasians. Some of the state Supreme Court justices said it's because their crimes are more severe. Haas stated, I anticipated that there would be a response, but when you adjust for previous criminal history of the juvenile, and when you adjust for the crime, blacks are still treated more harshly at every stage of the process. Haas concluded the reason for that more harsher treatment is the decisions that's been made by those people in authority to make the decision. The question in the juvenile justice system, is there liberty and justice for all? In 2009, Dr. Stephen Haas was again summoned to take a look at the concern that many African Americans have had that maybe racial profiling was happening on West Virginia's highways. Haas developed a survey instrument. It was distributed to the state police officers. And over a period of over a year and a half, they collect data on every traffic stop, the race of the person stopped, whether or not they were ticketed and searched. What Haas concluded from the analysis of these survey instruments that were collected was that blacks were stopped, they were ticketed, and they were searched at a much higher rate than whites. But after being searched, were found to have drugs and contraband at a much lower rate. The state police said, we do not racial profile, but they could give no legitimate reason as to why blacks were stopped, ticketed, and searched at a much higher rate and then found to have drugs and contraband at a lower rate. The question is, in West Virginia, are we committed to liberty and justice for all? During the 2012 legislative session, some African American leaders, after being summoned by then House of Delegate Representative Mr. Clifford Moore from McDowell County, to support the establishment of the Herbert Henderson Office of Minority Affairs. Delegate Moore and former House Speaker Rick Thompson wanted to see this office established to try to address some of the issues that have been outlined in the Select Committee on Minority Affairs report several years earlier. So this legislation passed the legislature, and the Herbert Henderson Office of Minority Affairs was established in 2012. But yet some 9 years later, the Herbert Henderson Office of Minority Affairs have yet to address any of the significant issues outlined in the 2003-2004 Select Committee on Minority Affairs report. And it has not mattered whether a Republican or a Democratic administration controlled the governor's mansion. The question is, in West Virginia, do we have a commitment to liberty and justice for all? In 2015, a group of African American leaders worked with legislators to develop a bill, Senate Bill 582. The intent was to create a bill that would allow for the creation of a pilot project to address poverty, substance abuse, and other social determinants of health like education, housing, workforce, and economic development in the context of comprehensive community development. The project was to be in a heavily populated African American community, particularly the west side of Charleston. The bill was introduced in the Senate, passed on a unanimous vote, then went to the House of Delegates, passed on a vote of over 88 of those who voted in approval, and the bill was then passed on to the governor, Earl Ray Tomblin, for his consideration. Governor Earl Ray Tomblin, for no real apparent reason, chose to veto this bill that was designed to address poverty, substance abuse, and other social determinants of health and health disparities in a heavily populated minority community without giving any logical reason as to why that was done. The question is, in West Virginia, are we committed to liberty and justice for all? In 2015, the United States Civil Rights Division sanctioned the state of West Virginia by taking away funding because the state had not responded to their citation in 2009 to address what is called disproportionality or the disproportionate minority contact, meaning the disproportionate overrepresentation of minority youth in the juvenile justice system, which Dr. Stephen Haas had outlined in his 2005 report. So even though the United States Justice Department cited and sanctioned the state of West Virginia, the state has yet to this day to take any significant steps to address the disproportionate minority contact with youth with the juvenile justice system. So one has to ask the question, in West Virginia, are we committed to liberty and justice for all? In 2015, after the murder of the 9 martyrs in Charleston, South Carolina, while they were in a weekly prayer meeting, and there was a call all over the nation to remove monuments that had been constructed in honor to Confederate soldiers. Then Governor Earl Ray Tomblin said there will not be any discussion in West Virginia about the removal or the renaming of Confederate monuments. One has to ask the question, in West Virginia, are we committed to liberty and justice for all? In 2015, that same year, the University of Pennsylvania issued a report on school suspensions and expulsions. And they were looking at the 13 southernmost states. And West Virginia is the northernmost southern state, so it was included in the report. The report points out how that in America there are over 2.6 million children suspended from school every year. Of the 2.6 million, 1.3 million are African American, and that in the 13 southern states, 55% of the 1.3 million students suspended from school in the southern state, in the United States, are suspended from those southern states. It was found that West Virginia has a suspension expulsion rate where black youth are suspended at twice that of white youth, yet the state school superintendent, the state school board, nor the legislature have taken no significant action to address that problem, even though it was brought to their attention in 2015. There are many of us in the African American community who describe the disproportionate suspension and expulsion of African American youth from school as the unnoticed, unrecognized, underlying social crisis condition. What I mean by that kids being suspended from school, they are put on the school to prison yard pipeline, and this is documented by a number of scholarly reports. But also, it results in them having lower academic achievement, more likely to drop out of school, more likely to enter the juvenile justice system. And even though there is a plethora of data in the state and nationally about how severe this problem is, for the last 5 years, the state of West Virginia's school superintendent, school boards, and the legislature refused to take any substantial action to address this problem. One has to ask the question, in West Virginia, is there a commitment to liberty and justice for all? In 2016, Delegate Larry Rowe from Kanawha County, working with the Commissioner for the Bureau of Public Health, Dr. Rahul Gupta, developed a piece of legislation that would require West Virginia to create a framework to address the health disparities that exist. In the state of West Virginia, African Americans have the worst community and population health outcomes, and this has been magnified and further exposed with COVID-19 in terms of blacks being much more susceptible to contracting COVID-19 and from having serious health consequences as a result. In 2016, Rowe and Gupta partnered to introduce the Minority Health Advisory Task Force, which would have created just a statewide task force, not an allocation of any resources. That bill was introduced every year, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 20. But the Republican-controlled legislature has refused to even put that bill on an agenda for conversation, for discussion, and for debate. So one has to ask the question, in West Virginia, is there a commitment to liberty and justice for all? In 2017, at the request of Governor Jim Justice, House Speaker Tim Armstead introduced a piece of legislation, House Bill 2724, the governor's bill, to create a model to serve as a template to address poverty, substance abuse, and other social determinants of health across the state of West Virginia. It was introduced at the request of the governor. Even though the governor requested that the bill be introduced, the governor's office has never executed the bill that the governor requested. So one has to ask the question, is there liberty and justice for all in the state of West Virginia when the governor and the legislature will not execute a bill that was passed with overwhelming support to address the issue of poverty in West Virginia? I think you're getting somewhat of a feel to what this narrative sounds like, but we could go on. In 2018, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation issued their life expectancy report, which pointed out that West Virginia has 5 cities that rank among the 50 cities nationally that have the lowest life expectancy. Logan ranked number 2. Number 9 is Hinton, West Virginia. Tied for 27 is the west side of Charleston and West Huntington, and 39th is Salem, West Virginia. Despite this data, this compelling data about the poor community and population health outcomes, the legislature still refused to advance legislation to try to improve the community and population health outcomes. In 2019, scholar Dr. Lori Andrus from West Virginia University School of Public Health compiled a report, an issue report, that shows that there is a significantly higher rate of infant mortality among African Americans, 1.7 times higher than that of Caucasians, yet no action has been taken to address it. Even to this present day, in 2020, the state of West Virginia received $1.25 billion of CARES Act funds from the federal government. Yet when requested to set aside 20% of that money, $250 million, to address poverty and other challenges in the 220 census tracts across the state that have poverty rates of more than 20%, the governor refused to do so. And lastly, just a few months ago, in a newspaper article by the Mountain State Spotlight, where they pointed out that the governor's bill from 2017 had never been actually executed, the governor's director of the Herb Person Office of Minority Affairs insisted that they had executed the bill when there is a preponderance of evidence to suggest otherwise. So we got to ask ourselves the question, where do we go from here? And are we as West Virginians are going to collectively take a stand and lift our voices to the legislative and executive branches of government to ask them to honor the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of equal protection under law, and to ask them to indeed honor the theme of in America, we believe we're one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And if we truly believe that, it's time for us to address some of these issues that are clearly delineated and outlined in these government-produced documents. I'm out of my time, and I thank you for yours.
I just moved to West Virginia when I was a kid. I marched the day after Martin Luther King died. And I love West Virginia, and I know she is more diverse and more progressive and more positive than people think. So I think it's important that we recognize that Martin Luther King's legacy comes all the way to the Mountain State.
So we're gathering here today to further the legacy of Martin Luther King because it is one of the most important voices of the American civil rights movement.
The march started in the early 80s, and I've been participating the whole time. And I think it's important that we continue this march because I do believe that God created us all equally. And until everyone's treated equally and fairly, then we need to strive to make that happen. The Constitution says with liberty and justice for all, and I believe until that day happens, I will encourage others, particularly our youth, to participate in functions like this that show that we can come together diversified and have the same common goals and work toward those.
Martin Luther King Day is important to me because I love seeing communities bring people together over one topic about race, about everything in the past, and we can just talk about why we feel that this day is important with each other. But I love seeing all the communities bringing people together with just love.
I think Martin Luther King Day is important because it not only stands up for blacks and white lives, it stands up for all lives, differently abled lives, things like that too. And it's really important for us to stand up to everything that matters to us.
We have to be teachers and leaders of this time of the world, and to be able to teach the young people of what they need to be and how much do they want to be, and how they can be kind to each other and to be able to love and trust each other in what they do.
Martin Luther King Day is important to me because all these people come here and just get together to just celebrate the past and how they made a difference.
I marched today because I feel that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s words are still so relevant in these times that are so full of division, and his vision for this country being a place that lives up to its ideals of respecting everyone is essential to not only celebrate, but to be inspired to carry forth.